Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the story of Mozambique. It's quite an intense journey, looking at how it went from being a Portuguese colony for so long to finally gaining independence.
That's right. And our main guide for this is a YouTube video transcript from New Africa.
Mm.
It really focuses on Samora Machel, framing his life as, well, central to that whole struggle for freedom and equality in Mozambique.
Okay, good point. So it's important, right, that we acknowledge this is based heavily on that one video's perspective.
Absolute crucial. History, as always, has many facets, many viewpoints. This video gives us a strong narrative, definitely. But our goal here is really to pull out the core story as presented in that source, Michel's role, the key events leading to independence, just to give you a clear understanding based on this account.
Got it. So let's dive in. The video kicks things off by talking about just how long Portugal was actually in Mozambique. We're talking centuries, not just decades.
Oh, yes, centuries. It starts way back the 1500s. Initially, they were just focused on the coast, places like the island of Mozambique, Sofala. But over the next, 400 years, they gradually pushed inland.
And how did they manage that? Just force?
Well, it was a mix. The video mentions diplomacy, trade initially, even intermarriage sometimes. But ultimately, yeah, armed force played a huge role, setting up trading posts, garrisons, especially along the Zambezi River.
And it wasn't exactly a gentle process, was it? The video mentions African slave armies and the slave trade itself.
No, not gentle at all. That's a really critical point the video makes. They use these African slave armies called chunda to help enforce their control. And Portugal was deeply involved in the transatlantic slave trade, shipping hundreds of thousands of Mozambicans off to Brazil, the Americas. Just horrific.
Wow, so this violence, this exploitation, it must have caused resistance from the start.
Exactly. There was always resistance. And this wasn't just about, taking resources. It actively held back local development, created this dependency that Mozambique really struggled with, even after it became independent.
The video brings up the Gaza Empire and King Gungunyana. That name sounds familiar.
It should.
Yeah.
Gungunyana led a major resistance movement in the late 1800s against the Portuguese expansion. And here's a direct link for us. Samora Machel's own grandfather apparently fought with Gungunyana.
No kidding. So that spirit of resistance was there in his family history.
It really was. It shows this wasn't something new that just sprang up with Machel's generation. But Gungunyana was defeated in 1895, exiled. And by the time Machel was born, which was 1933, the Gaza Empire was gone, and Portugal pretty much controlled almost all of Mozambique.
Okay, so Machel is born into this established colony, but Portugal itself was changing politically around then, wasn't it? From monarchy to something else.
It was. Big changes in Portugal, early 20th century. The monarchy was overthrown, and eventually this nationalist regime under Antonio de Oliveira Salazar took power. It's known as the Estado Novo, the new state. Sort of corporatist, very imperialist.
Corporatist meaning?
Basically, the state controls everything. Labor, industry, suppressing independent groups. But the key thing for Mozambique was, even though the government type changed in Portugal, the imperialist policies, they stayed firm.
Right, so Salazar just doubled down on keeping the African territories.
Absolutely. He saw them as, essential to Portugal's identity, its international standing. He talked about civilizing mission, but also, crucially, the economic benefits. Mozambique was seen as a source of raw materials, a market, and a place to send Portuguese settlers. They even offered incentives, portraying it as this land of opportunity.
But I'm guessing that opportunity wasn't for everyone. The video describes a pretty divided society.
Oh, definitely not for everyone. It was a far cry from the propaganda. Portuguese Mozambique was rigidly divided. Race, ethnicity, culture determined everything. White settlers were at the very top. That's land, housing, education, jobs, full citizenship, rights the works.
And then there was this group called the Assimilados. What was that about?
Yes, the Assimilados. It was, a strategy, you could say. A small group of Africans, Asians, mixed-race people could be granted this status if the Portuguese authorities decided they'd, sufficiently adopted Portuguese culture, language, religion, customs.
So kind of like honorary Portuguese citizens, almost.
Almost, but not quite. They got more rights than the vast majority of Africans, sure, but still nowhere near the level of the white settlers. And getting that status, incredibly tough. Formal application, had to prove you were assimilated. The video estimates less than 1% of the African population ever managed it.
Less than 1%, wow. So for almost everyone else, life was just restriction and exploitation. The video mentions forced labor, heavy taxes.
Yes, exactly. To push their economic plans, the Portuguese used brutal forced labor. Indigenous Mozambicans had to work on government projects, even on private Portuguese farms. Plus, they slapped on heavy taxes, which often forced people into this exploitative labor just to scrape enough together to pay.
That sounds incredibly harsh.
It was, and it had this knock-on effect. It pushed huge numbers of Mozambican men to leave, to go work in the mines in Rhodesia and South Africa. The pay was still terrible, but maybe, just maybe, enough to cover the taxes back home.
And that connects directly to Samora Machel's family, doesn't it? His father worked in those mines.
It does, directly. Michel's family eventually did okay as farmers, but they lived this reality. His father spent, I think the video says, over 10 years in the South African gold mines. Dangerous work, just to pay taxes and save a bit.
And the conditions were awful, I imagine.
Terrible. And the compensation if something happened, almost nothing. The video gives this heartbreaking example. Michel's brother died in the mines, and the family received a tiny, almost insulting amount of money.
You can see how experiences like that, both personal and seeing the wider system, would just fuel anger.
Undoubtedly. It clearly shaped his revolutionary views later on. Those early experiences of injustice were profound.
So let's move towards that resistance. Machel didn't have much formal schooling, but he trained as a nurse, right? Was that period important?
Very important. His schooling at a Catholic mission only went so far, 4th grade.
Okay.
But training as a nurse in Lourenço Marques, that's Maputo, now put him right in the city, seeing the inequalities up close. The video specifically mentions him being enraged by the government taking land from local farmers and giving it to Portuguese settlers. That land issue seems to have been a real trigger for him.
And this is all happening while the rest of Africa is starting to decolonize, right? Britain, France, Belgium were letting go of colonies. How did Portugal react to that pressure?
Portugal basically dug its heels in. Salazar's regime. No way were they considering decolonization. Instead, they tightened control. They used propaganda, started calling the colonies overseas territories to make it sound like one big happy family. They invested more in infrastructure, but also massively ramped up the secret police, the PID.
The PID. Notorious, weren't they?
Extremely. Spying, assassinations, recruiting double agents. They were ruthless in crushing any dissent. And another key strategy was deliberately limiting education and skilled job opportunities for Africans. Keep people down, keep them controllable. That was the thinking.
But even with all that repression, resistance started to organize properly, leading to FRELIMO.
It did. Several underground groups popped up, but the one that really gained traction was FRELIMO, the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique. Eduardo Mondlane was the key leader. They founded it in 1962, but crucially, Mondlane moved the headquarters to Tanzania pretty quickly to get away from the PID.
And where does Machel fit into this early picture?
Well, Machel was already on the PID's radar. He'd been complaining they suspected him of being involved in secret meetings. So in May 1963, he made the choice, left Mozambique, crossed into Tanzania, and joined FRELIMO.
So FRELIMO starts bringing people together. Was it a unified group from the start?
Not entirely. On the surface, maybe. But the video points out it was quite diverse. You had assimilados, non-assimilados, Asians, mixed-race people, even some white anti-colonialists. And beneath the surface, there were definite tensions. Big disagreements about what an independent Mozambique should actually look like.
Like what sort of disagreements?
A major one was about the white settlers and the assimilados. What happens to them after independence? You had a strong Marxist socialist wing. Mondlane, Marcelino dos Santos, Machel were part of this, who argued for equality for everyone, regardless of race. But then there was another view, more Afrocentric, led by people like Reverend Urias Amongo, who felt the government should be run by, well, ethnically authentic Mozambicans.
I see. So a clash of visions. Any other issues?
Yeah, the video mentions underlying ethnic tensions, too, and debates about just how Marxist the movement should be. So it wasn't all smooth sailing internally, even as they were planning the fight.
But despite those internal issues, they did launch the armed struggle. How did they prepare for that?
Well, they had a long-term plan for guerrilla warfare, and they got crucial early help from Algeria, which had just won its own independence war against France. Ahmed Ben Bella was the leader then. FRELIMO sent groups of fighters to Algeria for training with the Algerian FLN forces. Machel himself was in the second group that went.
So he got direct military training there.
He did. And when he came back, he was put in charge of one of FRELIMO's own military training camps. Then, on September 25th, 1964, they launched it. The armed struggle began. Initial attacks were in the north, launched from their bases in Tanzania. And, importantly, they had a lot of support from the local population there, who'd suffered under Portuguese rule for so long.
Did they have much success early on?
Surprisingly, yes. I mean, they were outgunned, less equipped initially. But with that local support in the north, they started taking control of territory. Portugal reacted, of course, sent thousands more soldiers, started recruiting Mozambicans into their own army, into the PAID as well. But still, within about 3 years, FRELIMO controlled a significant chunk of the north. The video suggests maybe a fifth of the country.
And they started getting outside help, too.
Yes, that became crucial. Support started coming in from communist countries, the Soviet Union, China, East Germany, weapons, training, supplies.
So the country becomes divided. These FRELIMO liberated zones, Portuguese-controlled villages called aldementos, and then active war zones. Must have been incredibly fractured.
Deeply fractured. That's a good way to put it. In the liberated zones, FRELIMO really worked on building support, keeping morale up. They put a big emphasis on education, political indoctrination too, setting up basic schools, literacy classes, even while the war was raging.
What about basic needs like food?
They tried to organize that too. Introduced basic health care, pushed collective farming for food security, which was a big shift from the colonial focus on cash crops for export. Machel apparently really encouraged FRELIMO fighters to work in the fields alongside the peasants, build that sense of shared effort.
But life in those zones couldn't have been easy, right? Constant threat, shortages.
Oh, absolutely not easy. Life was incredibly tough. Constant danger from Portuguese attacks, air raids, shortages of everything. Plus, the intense political indoctrination, long working hours on the collective farms, and very strict military discipline from FRELIMO.
So not everyone embraced it.
No. Some people fled the liberated zones, some even defected to the Portuguese side, maybe hoping for safety or better conditions. And FRELIMO came down hard on anyone they suspected of being a spy or a defector. At first it was re-education, but increasingly, the video suggests, it involved corporal punishment, prison, even summary executions.
That's a grim reality alongside the liberation struggle.
It is. A complex picture. But despite all those hardships, the video argues that for many Mozambicans, life under FRELIMO, with the promise of ending colonial rule, was still preferable to the tight control and exploitation in the Portuguese aldementos.
Meanwhile, Munlane was trying to get international support.
Yes, he was working hard on the diplomatic front. Traveled widely, tried to build support, visited Britain, for example. But then, tragedy struck. In February 1969, he was assassinated, killed by a parcel bomb.
Sent to him, who was suspected.
Widely believed to be the work of the PID, the Portuguese secret police. It was a huge blow to FRELIMO, and it led to this internal power struggle. Remember those earlier disagreements? They came to the surface.
With Machel eventually taking over.
Exactly. Reverend Simango, who led that more Afrocentric faction, was eventually expelled. And in 1970, Samora Machel became the leader of FRELIMO.
And under him, that Marxist-Leninist ideology became even more central.
Yes, Machel strongly identified with it, and FRELIMO really embraced those ideas fully under his leadership. That became the official doctrine.
Okay, so Machel's now in charge. Around the same time, the Portuguese bring in a new general who thinks he can finish FRELIMO off quickly. General Cololso de Arriaga. He was very confident, very boastful, promised a swift victory. And in 1970, he launched Operation Gordian Knot. This massive offensive in Cabo Delgado, the biggest Portugal mounted during the war. Huge resources poured into it.
Did it work?
Well, it definitely hurt FRELIMO, caused significant casualties, but it didn't break them. Ultimately, Gordian Knot failed to deliver that knockout blow Arriaga promised. In fact, you could argue it was a turning point against Portugal. They lost a lot of soldiers, wasted vast resources, and FRELIMO's morale, despite the losses, remained pretty strong. It showed Portugal couldn't just crush the resistance militarily.
And this wasn't Portugal's only war, was it? The cost must have been immense.
Immense. They were fighting 3 colonial wars simultaneously: Angola, Mozambique, and Portuguese Guinea. The financial drain was just unsustainable. The video cites an estimate that these wars were consuming something like 44% of Portugal's national budget. 44%. That's staggering. How did people in Portugal feel about this?
Increasingly negative. Huge numbers of young Portuguese men started emigrating just to avoid the draft, to avoid being sent to fight in Africa. The human cost, the financial cost. It made the Estado Novo regime deeply unpopular. Anti-war movements started growing. Students, workers, even some soldiers began questioning it all.
And all that pressure eventually led to a breaking point in Portugal itself.
It did. In April 1974, it all came to a head with the Carnation Revolution.
Carnation Revolution.
Yeah, a military coup, mostly led by left-leaning junior officers who were fed up with the wars and the dictatorship. They overthrew Salazar's successor, Marcelo Caetano. It was remarkably bloodless, actually. People put carnations in the soldiers' rifle barrels, hence the name. And just like that, Europe's longest-running dictatorship was over.
Wow. And what did that mean for Mozambique immediately?
Immediate change. The new government in Portugal, led initially by General Spínola, called for a ceasefire in Africa straight away. Negotiations started quickly between them and FRELIMO, and by September 1974, they signed the Lusaka Accords.
Setting the date for independence.
Exactly. The Lusaka Accords fixed the date, June 25th, 1975, which was a highly symbolic date. It was the 13th anniversary of FRELIMO's founding.
So after all those centuries, all that fighting, independence finally arrived, but the video suggests that wasn't the end of the story, was it?
Not at all. That's a really key point the video makes right at the end. Independence was huge, monumental, but it was just the beginning of a whole new set of struggles. Machel himself had that famous slogan, "A luta continua," the struggle continues. Meaning the fight for political freedom might be won, but the struggle to build a nation, to achieve real peace, prosperity, overcome the legacies of colonialism and war, was just starting. Machel and the new nation faced enormous challenges, building a country from scratch, essentially, after centuries of exploitation and a decade of brutal war.
So June 25th, 1975. A day of celebration, absolutely, but also the start of a very long, difficult road ahead.
Precisely. The end of over 450 years of Portuguese rule, the beginning of Mozambique charting its own course, building its own homeland.
Okay, so let's just quickly recap what we've covered in this deep dive. We started way back with the long history of Portuguese colonization, the oppressive system they built.
Right, the stratified society, the forced labor, the assimilado system.
Then the rise of FRELIMO, the leadership of Monlane, then Machel. We looked at the internal dynamics, the complexities within the movement itself.
Yeah, the different ideological strands, the tensions.
And then the armed struggle, the liberated zones, the hardships, the eventual turning of the tide, driven partly by the unsustainable cost for Portugal.
Leading to the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, which was the catalyst for final negotiations and independence.
And throughout, as the video presents it, Samora Machel's dedication really stands out as a driving force.
Yes, the narrative definitely centers him as embodying that fight for freedom and equality. But it also, importantly, doesn't shy away from the complexities and the immense challenges involved both during the war and, implicitly, what came after.
Which brings us to a final thought, maybe for you, the listener. When you think about this incredibly long and difficult fight for independence, what stays with you?
Yeah, what are the lasting legacies of that colonial past for a country like Mozambique? And what are the ongoing challenges for nations trying to build stable, prosperous futures after emerging from such struggles?
It's a history that definitely doesn't end in 1975. There's so much more to explore about Mozambique's journey since then. Definitely worth looking into further if this has sparked your interest.